Ladies and gents, it's Justin Johnson on my academic integrity of arts and humanities. We're on the module A328, Understanding Empires. We're on page 282, Economic Power, Transoceanic Empires. I influence you today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. Come to life, part of your life where you need to broaden, you might want to broaden your horizon, just sitting there, stand still, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to better your well-being, your vitality. You need to focus. You need to focus. If that means getting your academics, I'd highly recommend it. How do you go about doing it? Pick up a book, start reading. Page 282. Industrious people were either expelled or destroyed. Want of foresight became more fatal than innate barbarism, and men found themselves wading through blood and ruin when their object was only spoil. We may date the commencement of decline from the day on which Bengal fell under the dominion of foreigners, whom were more anxious to improve the present moment to their own amusement than by providing against waste to secure a permanent advantage to the British nation, with a particular want of foresight. They began to drain the reservoir without turning into any stream to prevent it from being exhausted. It was observed that money had commenced to become scarce in Bengal, whether that's scarcity by owing to the oppressions and exactions committed by the rulers or to stinginess of the public expense, or lastly, of the vast exportation of coin which is carried every year to the country of England, it being common to see every year 5 or 6 Englishmen, or even more, who repair to their homes with large fortunes. Lakhs piled upon lakhs have therefore been drained from this country, nor is the cheapness of grain to impose on the imagination. It arises from nothing else but the scarcity of coin, the decrease in the products in each district, added to the innumerable multitudes swept away by famine and morality. Still go on not all augmenting the depopulation of the country, so that an immense quantity of the land remains untilled and fallow, while those that are tiled cannot find a vent for their productions. Where are these men now, who rule everywhere, to remain for a length of time in command? They would become acquainted with the language, customs, and usages of one district, and would acquire full knowledge of several individuals that dwell in the same, nor is there any doubt but that they would rule much better, and become more likely to promote the welfare of the people, than would be a stranger, who always comes thoroughly unacquainted with either men, language, or country. And these rulers have their necessaries from their own country. It follows that the handy craftsmen and their artificers of this land suffer constantly, live in distress, and find it difficult to procure a livelihood sufficient to support their lives. For as the English are now the rulers and masters of this country, as well as the only rich men in it, to whom can these poor people look up for offering up their productions of their art, so as to benefit by their expenses? It is only some artificers that can find a livelihood with the English, such as carpenters, silversmiths, ironsmiths. The English appoint to offices at their pleasure, or on a powerful recommendation, or on a seniority of rank, without minding whether the appointment is completely incapable of fulfilling his duty, or unlikely even to acquire abilities. The English have besides a custom of coming for a number of years, and then of going away to pay a visit to their native country, without any one of them shewing an inclination to fix themselves in this land. Hence, ignorance and incapacity come to be transmitted from hand to hand. And as they join to that custom, that other one of theirs, whichever one of those immigrants holds to be of divine obligation, I mean, that of scraping together as money in the country as they can, and carrying it in immense sums to the kingdom of England. So it should not be surprising at all if these two customs blended together should be ever undermining and ruining this country, and should become an eternal bar to it ever flourishing again. So what happened? There is no doubt that Bengal was rich. Its industry in the 18th century was very productive, and the plains of the Ganges were among those most fertile agricultural landscapes in the world. Textiles and porcelain from Bengal were highly prized in Europe, obtaining the Diwani. Therefore, gave the EIC control of the rich source of revenue. In some respects, not much changed. The same taxes was raised under Bengal rule, and rates were similar, if collection was perhaps more rigorous. Too many commentators at the time. The problem was not so much the EIC as its agents, who were often ruthless in their tax collection methods and were also allowed to trade privately, and did so at scale. As Carl notes, for many the goal was to transfer their money back to Britain. Much wealth was collected illegally in the chaos of the war years. A parliamentary inquiry claimed that 740 million in 2021 prices. The Placely plunder was looted in 1763 to 65. Total remittance to Britain over the period of 1757 to 96 are conservatively estimated at 23 million, 1,815 million. In 2021 prices, politicians in Britain were worried about corruption, and the investigations at EIC were among the great scandals of the age. The role of the EIC, however, was as much a cause of problems as there were actions of its agents. As Dow and Khan identified, the EIC was now in reflect the ruler of Bengal, but it did not always act as one. For instance, John Wilson argues the effective governments in the past had taken steps to mitigate the effects of monsoon failure by building up or importing food reserves. In 1769 to 70, famine, some Indian landowners and businessmen, and a few EIC officers made similar effort, but their relief was piecemeal. For most EIC agents, instructions to collect taxes remained the priority. Their success was noted with satisfaction in London, where the EIC Council reported to the directors in February 1771 that, notwithstanding the great severity of the late famine and the great reduction of the people thereby, some increase in revenue has been made. The dividend on the EIC shares that year was 12.5%, the highest ever, cited in Dalrymple. As such, the EIC was continuing to act as a company with income its main goal. As can be seen in figure 910, revenue from taxation rose in the 1760s, leaving the company with a substantial surplus between 1771 and 1778. But by the late 1770s, the company was at war again, this time with the southern kingdom of Mysore. The graph shows expenditure on its military, the largest in the subcontinent, overtaking revenue. The EIC was no longer solely a trading company, but had become a territorial state in almost constant conflict with Indian rivals. The cost of these conflicts brought the company close to bankruptcy, to the alarm of both business and government circles in London. We should also note the impact of the EIC rule on the economy. You may have noted that in the previous activity, Khan describes a scarcity of coin until the 1760s. The EIC and its Dutch and French counterparts had mostly paid in silver for the Bengal goods, chiefly textiles and porcelain. The same silver that the Spanish mined in Peru and spent in Europe after the Battle of Plassey. However, silver imports to Bengal dropped dramatically as the EIC now paid for manufactured goods with tax revenues instead, and this disrupted industry and trade. Indian economic historian Rajat Datta is at pains to argue that if the EIC was often a difficult and exacting master, the economic consequences of its rule were not all negative. British demands stimulated an expansion in manufacturing, which was to last into the early 19th century. It also led to the growth of new crops such as indigo and opium, destined for export by the EIC. Since much production was still in Indian hands, there were many Indian craftsmen and merchants who benefited, even if the British siphoned off some of the profit. Yet Datta notes that prosperity comes with change. He finishes by arguing that the sectors of India's economy were henceforth tied in the vicissitudes of the global economy, and downturns in the latter cause harm to important components of the Indian economy or foreclosed the possibilities of their autonomous growth. We will return to this argument in section 5. Let's turn to our question, profits and costs. Think back on section 2.5 and 2.6. Who profited from the EIC rule in Bengal? Who bore the costs? Empire for free trade and global economy. In this section, we will use 4 case studies to look at the economics of imperialism. In the age of free trade, the first will build on the previous online section and explore the development of a settler society using Australia, one of the examples Balesh explores in his book. He will then turn to a tropical crop, rubber, which became important at the end of the 19th century, exploring similarities and contrasts with sugar. The third case study examines a British industry that depended on colonial raw materials, the Dundee jute industry. The section finishes with a brief discussion of British investment overseas. Australia, the economics of the settler society. British settlement of Australia started with the First Fleet, which brought almost 800 convicts, brave no, into New South Wales in 1788. Brave no. The prison colony was not a good foundation for settlers' colony. Not least 9% of convicts were male, although 40,000 convicts were transported, and there were some free settlers in 1828. The colony had grown to only 54,000 people. At the date, few settlers had ventured inland, and colony was largely dependent on British expenditure on the penal colony. All this changed over the 15 years. By 1841, there were 210,000 settlers in Australia, with new settlements in Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia. Historian James Boyce described the boom in Port Phillip, which went on to become Melbourne, under pressure from land-hungry squatters, often from New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. Officials decided to abandon attempts to limit the frontier of settlement, issuing squatter license to anyone who could demonstrate occupation. This favoured men with some resources. Between foundation 1837 and 1842. The human population of New Township grew from 1,000 to 20,000, while the number of sheep from 26,000 to over 1 million. 1 sheep per 3 acres were deemed sufficient to demonstrate occupation sheep runs. Deemed sufficient to demonstrate occupation sheep runs, which might occupy 25 square miles. Boise 2013, Labour, especially skilled labour, was the main issue. Ex-convicts were an early supply, soon supplemented by assisted migration, which brought 20,000 people to the settlement by 1841. Blish also notes the role of private land companies in encouraging the settlement and Australia's growing reputation as a land opportunity, not least, ironically, because of the letters honed by former convicts. The rapid expansion of settlement was both consequence and a cause of expulsion of the native Aboriginal population. Unfarmed land was widely declared waste of government land in British colonies, often setting aside the claims of hunter-gatherers and pastoralists. In Unit 10, you have to explore the legal arguments used to justify the occupation of land that the settlers saw as barely used. Accompanying this was a sense that the environment should be reformed to meet the needs of the settlers. According to Sharon Morgan, historian of early settlement in Tasmania, almost everything like the settler did was a recreation of the world that had left behind. Such approach took little account of fragile environments or the potential cost of the introduction of European fauna and flora. Belish argues that the early boom in settler colonies was followed by the bust and then revival based on exports. Port Phillip experienced bust in the 1840s as some of the speculative projects failed, undermining confidence in others. Resistance by first Australians, Aborigines, also alarmed investors, but the failure of many early squatters opened the way for a new export-based economy. Surviving farmers were able to build up still larger sheep runs as reduced freight costs lowered transport costs. Wool became the first of Australia's export products, growing fourfold between 1839 to 1842. In 1862, wool represented over half Australia's non-gold exports, and it remained a quarter of total exports until 1961, contributing massively to Australia's prosperity. The settlement in the land could be a daunting experience, but after an early period of economic instability, for those it proved a success. Australia had one of the world's highest incomes per head in the second half of the 19th century. Prosperity, of course, come at an enormous price. This explains the relationship between the first Australians and the British settlers. It was also based on links between the metropole. Wool created profits for Australian settlers, as did gold in different ways, following the gold rush of 1851. Also for British-based shipping firms and manufacturers. Early in this unit, we have looked at how if tropical and subtropical agricultural crops such as sugar and tobacco become colonial staples, often grown on plantations. We have seen a metropolitan demand in the cheap labour made it possible to grow such products at scale. Sometimes to the exclusion of all other crops. New such crop developed in the late 19th century with changing consumption patterns and industrial needs. One such crop was rubber, a latex tape with a range of different tropical plants of native to South America and Africa. As early as 1837, a process was found to make rubber sufficiently durable to be used in shoes and for installation. Demand, however, only really worked off at the end of the century when rubber began to be used in tyres. First for bicycles in the 1890s and then for motor cars. Global production rose from 10,000 tonnes to 1875 to 120,000 tonnes in 1913. At first, demand was met from plundering wild rubber, pleading to the brutal exploitation of people and the environment in the Amazon and Congo basins, which eventually caused huge scandals. The Congo is discussed further in Unit 16. More significant in ending the wild rubber boom, however, was that plunder was unable to keep up with demand. Attempts to develop rubber plantations in Brazil also failed. Wild rubber was subject to a fungus that was largely kept in check by the plant's dispersal in the rainforest, but it spread like wildfire on plantations. The solution was to grow rubber plants in parts of the world where the fungus was not prevalent. During the 19th century, botanical gardens such as Kew in London saw it as part of their remit to explore whether useful plants could successfully be transported from one colony to another. Brazilian rubber plants were grown from seed, first in London and later Colombo and Singapore. The Dutch also experimented at their botanic garden at Buitenzorg outside Batavia. The plants flourished and were soon widely cultivated in Southeast Asia, first in Malaysia, then on the island of Sumatra, in the Netherlands, East Indies, and in the French of Indochina. Only 140 hectares were planted with rubber in Malaysia in 1897, but in 1914 there were 455,000 hectares. Overall rubber production in Asia rose from 3 tonnes in 1900 to 420,000 to 46 tonnes in 1919, over 90% of the global production. Rubber first developed a monoculture plantation crop. Large acres of tropical forest were raised, land was drained and weeded, the trees were planted in orderly, spaced rows. Clearing the land and maintaining the plantation required far more labour than was available in the sparsely populated forest areas, so workers were recruited from other parts of East Indies and Indochina. And in the case of Malaya, from South India, the plantations were often like frontier outposts in which European managers lorded it over large immigration workforces, often relying on coercion to keep orders. Colonial government supported the plantation companies with grants of cheap land, helping with recruiting labour, and government funded research stations. In turn, rubber made the colonies rich. Malaya was the second wealthiest country by GDP in Asia and after Japan. In obvious parallels, it can be seen with plantation crops such as sugar. There were also differences. One in demand, rubber was largely possessed in Europe and the United States by big companies, such in the Michelin in France and Goodyear in the Firestone in the US. By the 1920s, the US consumed 70% of the world's rubber, and US companies dominated free market. High prices during the First World War raised production and caused a post-war glut. In Britain, attempts to maintain prices by organising a cartel to limit production. However, they were unable to persuade Dutch producers backed by the US tyre companies to join them. As a result, the price of rubber fell and continued to fluctuate throughout the interwar years. One reason for Dutch reluctance to join a cartel was concern about competition of smallholders who were expected to evade limits on production. In 1920 and 1930, production by smallholders grew rapidly so that by 1940 they accounted for around half of the production of the Dutch East Indies. Smallholder practice was often different. At this had ecological benefits. The clean weeding practiced on plantations left soils exposed to erosion. In monsoon rains, rubber plantations were also fertile grounds for plant fungi and the mosquitoes that spread malaria. Small farmers, by contrast, avoided many of these problems. They added rubber plants to existing system of cultivation, which land used alternated between periods of intensive use and periods where land was allowed to recover. The slow-growing rubber trees were planted the year after the first clearing, provided shade in the following years, and maturing during the fallow phase. And after 5 years, when the rubber trees were ready for tapping, all that needed was to clear low undergrowth for access. This system required much less maintenance than open orchards, and the soil on plants were protected. The rubber trees, once so-called economic trees, all have broadly the same economic life history. First, the land must be cleared and prepared for planting. As a rule, the young trees must be protected from animals. Most types begin to bear only 5 to 7 years. 7 in the case of rubber, hence there is considerable time before they are established and begin to yield. Some return to original investment. Then comes a long period of yielding. As a rule, the yield increases for the first 5 years and reaches its peak about 10 or 12 years after planting. Stays there for about 15 years and then begins to fall off. During this period, the income from the trees is of the nature of economic rent. Yields may vary with the amount of manuring or weeding, but the cost of extracting some yield is often quite low. Hence, large outputs are likely to continue to come forward even when prices are very low. An example of this is the large quantities of rubber which continued to come forward from the Netherlands East Indies during the 30s, even when the net return to the native producer was less than 2p a pound. Finally, there is the problem of replacement. But by replanting on the same land or by planting on land not at present under that crop, clearly a producer who wishes to maintain his capital in act must set aside funds out of his income. A longish period of high prices, which seems likely to continue, may lead to a large amount of new planting. During the Great Depression of 1929 to 1932, the total volume of the world agriculture outwardly hardly declined, all despite a very hard fall in prices. It is probably true, as a broad generalisation, that agriculture output as a whole responded very sluggishly to a general fall in demand. One important reason is a large part of agriculture output is produced on family farms. Unless the farmer can get a job, he is constrained to carry on in order to live. These generalisations, however, happen to apply less to rubber growing than the most branches of agriculture. The facts are that the output of the rubber fell considerably during the slump of the smallholders' output, fell much more than estate output. Estates could be expected to maintain production at a fairly constant rate until the price declined below direct cost, which on the majority of estates were only 1/3 or 2/5 of total costs. The supply of smallholders' rubber was more elastic than the estate output, principally because the ability of the smallholders to turn to alternative sources of earnings. A smallholder will strive hard to maintain his standard of living. Faced with all fall in the net return, the typical smallholder tends to look around to see whether he can do something else which pays him better. If he cannot find anything better, he may do more work on his own holding, tapping with more trees. In some are formerly untapped, How much work he does tend to vary with his need for cash. When the price of rubber is high, on the other hand, the smallholder with a fairly large holding can afford to take on outside workers. Even a smallholder with a fairly small holding may engage workers. It is thus perfectly impossible for smallholders' total output to go down when the price of rubber falls. Smallholders who are not desperately in need for cash may hold back their output for some months if they think that prices are unduly now low. Benham explains smallholder resilience in terms of flexibility rather than a long-term strategy. Bohr explained in terms of flexibility rather than long-term strategy. Europeans were forced to recognise their adaptability, but this is often grudgingly. References were made to lower quality rubber and wasteful practices. Fears were expressed that small holdings were incubators of disease. But the work of the agricultural research stations showed that the quality of smallholder rubber was as good as that of the plantations and their methods less destructive. Agronomists came to advocate a more ecological approach, drawn in part from the observation of smallholder practice. This was, however, often couched in patronising terms. As in 1925 Dutch report, the native intuitively took the correct path, while the European rubber planter gradually has learned to change its operations that were initially far too intensive. In fact, the smallholders were quick to adopt new ideas. Proved effective, including planting some of the new varieties of rubber developed by the research stations. Ross highlights the rise of smallholder production and notes that rubber was not the only crop where indigenous producers were able to find a niche in the free trade world. In cocoa, or even in cotton, African farmers also proved very resistant to attempts to dragoon them into working in ways that suited colonial rulers. Yet it would be wrong to see rubber solely in these terms. Rubber started as a plantation crop, and plantations continue to supply at least half of Southeast Asian rubber. The plantation sector also enjoyed a revival after the Second World War, even if it was small producers who came to dominate after independence. Big rubber companies also continued to exercise control of the market. This was aided by the development of synthetic rubber during the war. Not should a resilience of small farmers disguise the high ecological costs of rubber protection, particularly in the early 20th century. Large areas of tropical forest were cleared to make way for rubber plants and plantation. Agriculture led to land erosion, the silting up of the rivers, and the loss of biodiversity. Human costs were also very high, particularly for many immigrant workers were brought in to create and maintain the plantations. Last page, 295. Let's turn now from the colonies to the metropole. If we think of a textile industry linked to empire, it is likely to be cotton, the most dynamic industry of the early industrial revolution. The Lancashire industry imported raw cotton from the southern states of the United States and exported cotton cloth all over the world. The South was outside the British Empire after the American Revolution, but it had developed within the same slavery plantation complex as Caribbean sugar, and when the American Civil War of 1861-65 cut off supplies, British and European cotton merchants turned to India, Egypt and West Africa. Increasingly, the industry come to rely on empire markets. Yet, there's another British textile industry that was even more closely entwined with empire. This was jute. and its first century was the Scottish city of Dundee, eastern Scotland, had long been a linen industry in which home-grown and later imported flax was woven into a range of goods from fine sheets and tablecloths to sails and sacking. The factory-based linen industry developed by the 1830s. Flax imports come mostly for the Baltic and so were badly affected by the Crimea War of 1853 to 56 to maintain production. Dundee manufacturers turned to jute to supplement and indeed replace flax. If the American Civil War caused a crisis in Lancashire, it was boom time in Dundee as demand for coerced sacking and sandbags soared. Jute imports into Dundee rose from 16,928 tonnes in 1851 to 321,331 tonnes in 1901 by Goldie, 1987, which is on page 123. Page 296, we're going to pause that there. Have a lovely day.
Right, get off.